Okay, we're ready to go. However you describe the work that you do as a qualitative researcher, it's highly likely that you're working with material that is outside of immediate conscious awareness. Some people might call it the pre-conscious or the subconscious. Some might refer to a psychodynamic approach or talk about defense mechanisms or projective techniques. Mainly, I see a lot of projects that just talk about working in depth or below the surface without being any more specific. Very few of us talk about the unconscious per se, which is very interesting because the history of qualitative research has a strong early theme of the Freudian psychoanalytic unconscious. During and after World War II, some psychoanalysts, and to be fair, anthropologists and sociologists from Europe, established themselves as researchers in the US. One of these was Ernest Dichter, who founded motivational research. He and Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, who actually reinvented propaganda into PR, built the consumerist society that we work within today. What happened was that America was scared of what would happen if deep-seated human desires were subverted by totalitarian states. Remember, this was the time when Germany and Russia had frightened people with their ability to apparently take over the will of the individual. It was believed that if these desires were channeled into consumer goods instead, then people would become immune to these mass movements. Because this point of view was supported by politicians in America, Dichter and Bernays were quite overt about their role in what was called the engineering of consent. Ultimately, though, they paid the price for their perceived manipulation and were discredited. Nevertheless, I'd say it's really, really worth reading. There's a very short article about Dichter in The Economist. And actually, I find the strategy of the desire, although he wrote it in 1960, as a very revealing and interesting book. Alternatively, there's a BBC documentary called The Century of the Self by Adam Curtis, which describes this process in a much more detail. But I don't want to stay with this now. Just think about the fact that the idea that people can manipulate unconscious desires may be one reason why we as researchers don't like to talk about the unconscious. But there is another one, actually. Now, this is Freud's tripartite theory of the psyche. We have the id, the ego in the middle, and the superego. And it was actually quite sophisticated at the time. Many people don't realize he had a grounding in neurology. But as it was popularized by people like Bernays and all the psychoanalysts who started building practices in the States, it actually became a series of cliches. So I'm just going to show you one description that kind of shows a popular conception of this kind of Freudian unconscious, which is it's a maiden aunt and a sex-crazed monkey locked in mortal combat in a cellar, refereed by a rather nervous bank clerk. Now, personally, I still think that occasionally this is quite a useful model to use, especially with issues to do with food, oddly enough. But actually, it really doesn't play too well to a modern audience. And what's happened is that the explanatory power of this kind of way of looking at the unconscious has declined, while at the same time, cognitive psychology was blending with various forms of neuroscience and experimental method, and showing us another picture of the unconscious, which was all about processing out of conscious awareness. So there were various estimates that somewhere between 90 and 98% of what goes on in our brains never actually comes to consciousness. Well, there's a very long story involved in all of this, but to cut it short, what eventually happened was that we ended up with, behavioral economics. So we've all had to get to grips with System 1 and System 2, although I have to say I take particular delight in having this sort of allegedly scientific proof of what we qualis have been saying all along about decision making. But actually, I think even behavioral economics has kind of failed to light up the qualitative universe, despite the efforts of many, many keen promoters. And here is a particular reason. Now, just take a moment to look at these two lists. How would you prefer to describe yourself? I don't know about you, but I'm kind of heading over to the left-hand side. But actually, the picture on the right-hand side is the new picture of the human being that is implied by a great deal of these initial findings from behavioral economics. And actually, I think in some ways it's quite hard for us to accept, certainly for me. BE seems to be all about poor choices, irrationality, biases, the effects of context, misunderstanding certain kinds of probability. In short, our inability to be effective witnesses to our own behaviour because we still think we are competent and rational. And then on top of that, you get the choice blindness experiments that show that we confabulate or rationalize to explain the choices that either we didn't know we'd made or didn't even make. In these experiments, people are shown two faces and they choose one of them. Unbeknownst to them, those two faces are switched under the table and they're given the card of the other face. Now, in 80% of cases, people didn't even notice that the faces had been switched. And then they went on to give a detailed and rational description of why they had preferred that particular card. Now, I don't need to spell out the implications of that for you. And then just one final point about this. If we look at the old way of thinking about rational decision making and then put on the long list of these cognitive biases, they seem to make a mockery of what goes on. So where are we? Well, actually, I think that BE has taught us a lot about context, heuristics, the value of immersive and projective techniques, good framing, stimulus material, and it's given us a whole new set of levers for change. But actually, the image of the human being that it projects, it kind of makes us out to be irrational and a bit stupid. So the question has to be, why do we have these biases? Where do they come from? And scientists have turned to evolutionary psychology now and the structure of the brain to explain this. This changes things a lot. First of all, a very brief review of the brain. We have a brain that comes in three sections. There is the old brain stem, sometimes known as the reptilian or the lizard brain, if you want to be populist about this. This is the part that controls instinct and survival. This is about our fight, freeze, or flight response, and it's automatic. It's very, very quick. It's there to keep us safe. Then in the midbrain, the limbic system, the amygdala, This is all about emotion and learning and memory, and it's the part that you need for parenting and bonding if you're going to bring up youngsters who are not going to be independent for a long period of time. Now, interestingly enough, all sorts of damage to this part of the brain completely inhibit decision making. Even the simplest decisions are very hard to make if this part of the brain is damaged. And then finally, we have the thing that we think of really mostly as our brain, where the higher mental processes take place, language and skills and so on. Now, setting aside the sort of slightly uncanny resemblance to Freud's id, ego and superego in this model, we can actually see that this lower brain and the midbrain contribute to quite a lot of the system one fast thinking. These quick, emotionally led decisions are there to keep us safe and to make sure that our children survive in order to pass on our genes. While the neocortex, the higher cortex, is much more like system 2. This is the place where we do the deliberative, focused stuff. Now, our brains actually evolved during a period called the Pleistocene, which ended relatively recently in evolutionary terms. So they had a long time to evolve physically, but they've not really caught up very much since then. So if you think about our ancestors at this time, probably hunter-gatherers living in tribal groups, they lived in small groups, relatively, 100, 150 groups probably, which is why our brains find it hard to get around the impact of numbers in thousands and millions. Obviously for them, safety was about safety in numbers, which is why there are so many biases that lead us to go along with the herd and copy each other. If you can imagine, food resources must have been quite precarious. Let's say you caught a saber-toothed tiger and somebody else took it away. This was a very serious matter. No wonder we have loss aversion. Similarly, we didn't get to choose from 57 varieties of saber-toothed tiger. It was either that or woolly mammoth. So actually, our brains aren't great at making complex choices. Our ancestors were at constant risk of disease and physical harm, so it made sense to stereotype strangers and stay with the familiar. And there wasn't time to work out if it was a twig or a snake you were about to step on. You just made a fast judgment and avoided it. Also, context and environment were everything. So priming and framing made a lot of sense. And because life expectancy was short, they lived in the now and didn't really see the value of putting things away for the future. And if you've done financial research, you will know that this is one area particularly prone to behavioral economics effects. So even now, as we live in a modern environment, our brains haven't changed. The brains and the endocrine systems carry on with these ancient response patterns. This is maybe how our primitive brain sees the modern world. It categorizes every element of the environment, either as something positive or something that can do us harm. And we can react on this basis. Phobias are a good example of the primitive brain in action. In the old environment, it would make sense to have phobias about snakes and spiders. And if our physical brain evolution had kept up with our new environment, we should technically have phobias about ladders, slippery floors, swimming pools, guns, cars, and all sorts of other things that can be sources of danger to us. But I don't want to stay on this for too long because the important part of this talk is about reframing the idea of a primitive unconscious into something that's much wiser and that is adaptive. So this is really the point where we lose the Freudian unconscious and the cognitive unconscious, and we meet the adaptive unconscious. Now, if you think about it, we're the survivors. We survived through all of those periods in evolutionary times. So we have built-in strategies for survival. And in the book, The Rational Animal, which I highly recommend and we'll talk about a little bit later, they talk about our unconscious, not necessarily about as being kind of like a council of elders. Apart from systems 1 and 2, what we have is a series of what they call subselves that can come to the fore with behavior that helps us overcome each of the main evolutionary challenges. Now, actually, I don't know, some people might have issues with subselves or want to call them subpersonalities, or you might want to call them subprograms. There's no need to get hung up on that. It's a metaphor, in effect, but it's a useful way for thinking about this. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about these subselves. In The Rational Animal, they talk there are 7 subselves. I might want to add a couple more, actually, but you know, this is beyond the scope of this presentation. The key point is that these all kick in when they're primed by simple triggers. So, for example, there is a self-protection subself that has thoughts and behaviors that help keep us out of danger. So while that might be triggered by being in a car park late at night or on a lonely train platform, it would also be triggered perhaps by watching a scary movie or reading a frightening passage in a book. The status-seeking subself would be triggered by opportunities for raising your status within a group, or maybe by feelings of inferiority if somebody's put you down. The affiliation subself will be triggered by cues to do with friendship, connecting with people, working together, doing things together, or perhaps even feeling lonely. So actually, there is a very simple path from the triggers that goes right down to the ultimate explanation of the subself. This concept of subselves just connects up all of these things about context, triggers, and thinking behavior. Just a brief example. A girl has booked a weekend in Barcelona for herself and her boyfriend. Well, we can find out the proximate factors, the triggers, the surface reasons that she will tell us straight away. Qualitative research would identify that she was talking with friends, that there's something positive about Barcelona, it's trendy, it's a place to go, and you know, the boyfriend had been moody or whatever. What she may or may not talk about, and what this theory gives us, is the idea of this ultimate factor, this fundamental motivational system that's kicked in, which is, sadly, as it's called, mate retention, certainly one of those that needs to be renamed. But it's about needing to protect the relationship. And the interesting thing about this is that once you realize that that is working within this scenario, then there are lots of other thoughts and behaviors relating to mate retention that will pop up and that we can look for and use to explain in much more depth. Just to give you another quick example, here's one about disease avoidance, where we've got the origins, we've got the triggers. But the interesting thing about this is that disease avoidance subself goes beyond germs. This is about being wary of foreigners, wary of strangers, wary of odd foods, wary of disgusting smells, strange colours, anything that looks and feels contaminated. And here we can see quite a lot of the behavioural economics thinking, the stereotyping, stigmatisation, prejudice, fear of contamination, avoidance, rejection, all sorts of things, and the behaviour that links into this. So what this helps with is thinking on a broader scale, beyond just disease or germs, but think about the implications for the immigration debate, GMO foods. I mean, the very fact that they were called Frankenfoods gives you a clue of what Subself was operating at the time. Anyway, fascinating as this is, I don't want to stay focused on this. I would really, really recommend reading the Rational Animal. It's actually got quite a few examples from marketing. It's a good read and it's quite easy to see how to apply it. There are several other books to read. Strangers to Ourselves is also a very good one about, it's called Discovering the Adaptive Unconscious. Although in some ways, Timothy Wilson is much more negative about our ability to perceive our own subconscious. But in any case, it's certainly worth looking at if you're interested in this. So let me just start summarizing now. We talked about going from the unconscious to the non-conscious. Now, I left out the beginnings of the unconscious with the Plato and philosophers, and I went straight into Freud, forgetting about Jung and the collective unconscious and all of that. But, you know, there's plenty of that in the history. From that, we moved on into neuroscience, and this concept of the unconscious about being really brain doing processing out of conscious awareness, which then leads into cognitive psychology and behavioral economics. Some people are now talking about that as the adaptive unconscious. And now we have the new term of the non-conscious, which seems to be adopted quite widely. And my theory about that is really that it just doesn't have that baggage that the word unconscious has with it. So actually, what does this new non-conscious include? Well, apart from some of the terminology, it's actually not terribly different from my first chart, which really means that qualitative research has many of the tools and techniques to investigate these influences. We can capture all that in-the-moment stuff, associations, moods, emotional triggers, links. It's what we do. But just hang on a minute. I don't know if any of you have come across this, but it really made me think twice when I did. Yup, it's the Non-Conscious Impact Measurement Forum. Yes, measurement, and it's now in its second year. Now, there is a whole new set of agencies offering not only descriptions about the non-conscious and how it operates in consumption and so on, but also techniques such as eye tracking, facial coding, biometrics, implicit association tests, and often within a framework of behavioral economics too. Well, this is good old System 2 fighting back with graphs and numbers. Now, at the moment, we don't really know where this is going to go. But I've been around for long enough to know that clients have always loved the apparent certainty of this kind of research. So I think that for us as qualitative researchers, there are three implications. First of all, don't be intimidated by the jargon. Yes, it's new, but in some ways it's the same old. And we need to be in this conversation. We need to have a point of view about this. And whatever these guys are measuring, it's all going to have to be interpreted for it to make sense. So, and that's what we do. It's what we specialize in. Secondly, what we need to do is to really update projectives. I feel that projectives have become a little bit tired. People call them games. They don't really write about them very much in proposals anymore. It's just, we'll do some projectives to go deeper. Whereas in actual fact, if you look at them very closely, they have a huge amount of value in working with these various aspects of the non-conscious, with this material. And I think we should make much more effort to explain and justify their use. And finally, I would suggest that we can experiment more with methods. Qualitative data doesn't just come from groups anymore. It's everywhere. It's in social media. It's in communities. It's really not so much about where it comes from, but the qualitative thinking that's applied to what we do. So why don't we actually try using an implicit association test ourselves as part of a program of research? Why don't we work more like the experimental psychologists? We can now even test, a word which in the past I wouldn't have associated with qual, but we could test qualitatively and provide much, much more robust recommendations in the way that behavioral economics is able to do. So my time is up now. I'm going to say thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to hand back to Ken to deal with questions. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Joanna. That was really good food for thought. I'm sure that you will have lots of questions yourself, and I also would think that you may want a second chance to listen to this. The good news is we actually have been recording it, so you can get onto the AQR website within the next couple of weeks and it will be up there. But if you like to key your questions in, Joanna will grab hold of them and will answer them by email. If there's anything that's sort of really pressing you would like to have distributed, then I'm sure we can organise that too. Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you in the next webinar. And thanks, Joanna.